The moment I heard my daughter whisper to her husband that I was becoming an embarrassment at my own grandson's birthday party, something inside me shifted forever. What she didn't know was that I controlled the very trust fund she was counting on for her son's future. What happened next would teach her a lesson about respect that she'd never forget. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Vivian Blackwood, and at 73, I thought I'd seen every shade of family disappointment. I was wrong. The revelation came on a sunny Saturday afternoon in September at what should have been one of the happiest days of my life, my grandson Timothy's 8th birthday party. I'd been living in the affluent suburb of Maplewood Heights for 47 years, ever since my late husband Charles and I bought the sprawling colonial on Elm Street with money from his successful pharmaceutical company. Charles had been gone for 6 years now, and in that time, I'd watched my relationship with my daughter Sophia slowly deteriorate into something unrecognizable. Sophia had always been particular about appearances. Even as a child, she would arrange her dolls with obsessive precision, making sure their clothes were perfectly pressed and their hair immaculately styled. I thought it was just a phase, something she'd outgrow. Instead, it became the foundation of her adult personality. She married Richard Pemberton, a corporate lawyer whose family owned half the real estate in downtown Maplewood, and together they'd built what looked like the perfect life from the outside. Their house was a testament to calculated success, a modern masterpiece of glass and steel that had been featured in Architectural Digest. Their son Timothy attended the most exclusive private school in the county. Their social calendar was packed with charity galas and country club events. To anyone watching from a distance, they were living the American dream. But I saw the cracks. I saw how Sophia would tense up whenever I suggested we spend time together without Richard present. I noticed how she'd quickly change the subject whenever I mentioned wanting to take Timothy on adventures like I used to do with her when she was young. Most painfully, I watched as my grandson began to mirror his parents' obsession with perfection, becoming anxious and withdrawn whenever anything didn't go exactly according to plan. The morning of Timothy's birthday party, I spent extra time getting ready. I chose my favorite dress, a vintage floral print that Charles had always said brought out the green in my eyes. I had my hair done at the salon and even treated myself to a manicure. I wanted to look my best for my grandson's special day. I arrived at Sophia's house at exactly 2 o'clock, carrying the gift I'd carefully selected, a vintage compass that had belonged to my father, along with a leather-bound journal for Timothy to record his own adventures. It wasn't the latest video game or designer clothes that the other children would bring, but it was meaningful. It had history. It had love behind it. The party was already in full swing when I walked through the front door. The house had been transformed into something that looked more like a magazine photo shoot than a child's birthday celebration. Professional caterers moved efficiently through the crowd, serving gourmet appetizers to parents who looked like they'd stepped off the pages of a fashion magazine. A hired photographer captured every moment with the precision of a wedding shoot. Timothy spotted me immediately and ran over with genuine excitement lighting up his face. At 8 years old, he still had that wonderful quality of children where joy was pure and unfiltered. He hugged me tightly, and for a moment, everything felt exactly as it should. "Grandma Vivian, I'm so glad you're here. Did you see the magician? And the pony rides? Mom hired real ponies." His enthusiasm was infectious, and I found myself smiling despite the overwhelming opulence of the event. "It's wonderful, sweetheart. Happy birthday." I handed him his gift, watching as his eyes lit up at the sight of the compass. He was genuinely intrigued, turning it over in his hands and asking me how it worked. We spent several minutes together as I explained how his great-grandfather had used it during his adventures, and Timothy listened with the kind of rapt attention that children reserve for stories that truly capture their imagination. It was during this conversation that I first noticed the looks. Other parents were glancing in my direction with expressions that ranged from polite confusion to barely concealed disdain. I began to understand that my vintage dress, which I'd thought looked elegant, was being perceived as outdated. My gift, which I'd chosen with such care, looked shabby next to the professionally wrapped boxes containing tablets and designer sneakers. Sophia appeared at my side with the kind of bright, artificial smile she'd perfected for social situations. "Mom, let me introduce you to some of the other parents." She guided me through a series of brief, superficial conversations where I was presented as Timothy's grandmother rather than by name, as if my primary identity was simply my relationship to their family rather than my own accomplished life. I tried to connect with these people, sharing stories about Timothy and asking genuine questions about their own families, but I could feel the invisible walls they'd erected. To them, I was an oddity, an elderly woman who didn't quite fit into their carefully curated world of status and sophistication. The moment that changed everything happened near the bounce house. Timothy had convinced me to try it with him, despite my protests that I was too old for such activities. His laughter and enthusiasm broke down my resistance, and soon I found myself bouncing awkwardly alongside him, my careful hairdo coming undone and my vintage dress billowing in ways that were decidedly undignified. Timothy was having the time of his life, and his joy was infectious. For those few minutes, I forgot about the judgmental stares and the uncomfortable social dynamics. I was just a grandmother playing with her beloved grandson, creating the kind of memory that would last a lifetime. It was when I climbed out of the bounce house, breathless and laughing, my hair disheveled and my dress wrinkled, that I heard it. Sophia was standing nearby with Richard and another couple, and she clearly thought she was far enough away that I wouldn't overhear her. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. "I'm so sorry about my mother," she said in a voice that carried just far enough for me to catch every devastating word. "She's becoming such an embarrassment. I don't know what to do with her anymore. She just doesn't understand how to behave in social situations like this." Richard nodded in agreement, adding, "Maybe it's time to consider some kind of assisted living situation. She's clearly not adapting well to being around people anymore." The other couple murmured sympathetic responses about the challenges of dealing with aging parents, and Sophia continued, "The worst part is she doesn't even realize how inappropriate she's being. Timothy adores her, but I can't have her ruining events like this. What will people think?" I stood there, frozen in place, feeling as if I'd been physically struck. The bounce house that moments before had been filled with laughter and joy now felt like the scene of a crime. The simple act of playing with my grandson, the purest, most natural thing in the world, had been transformed in my daughter's mind into a source of shame and embarrassment. I looked down at my wrinkled dress and touched my messed-up hair, suddenly seeing myself through their eyes. But instead of feeling shame, I felt something else entirely. A cold, calculating anger that started in my chest and spread outward until it reached every nerve ending in my body. I managed to compose myself enough to get through the rest of the party, but every smile felt forced, every laugh hollow. I watched Sophia move through the crowd, effortlessly charming the other parents, playing the role of the perfect hostess while carefully managing her social image. I saw how she subtly redirected conversations whenever anyone asked about me, how she positioned herself physically to create distance between us. When it came time for Timothy to open his presents, I watched from the sidelines as he unwrapped gift after expensive gift. Designer clothes, the latest gaming system, a professional-grade skateboard, a tablet loaded with educational apps. Each present was met with polite enthusiasm from Timothy and effusive praise from the watching parents about how thoughtful and generous everyone was. When Timothy reached my compass and journal, there was a noticeable shift in the room's energy. The other couple exchanged glances that I now recognized as pity mixed with second-hand embarrassment. Timothy, bless his heart, held up the compass with genuine excitement and announced to everyone that it had belonged to his great-grandfather and that I was going to teach him how to use it for real adventures. Sophia's smile became strained as she quickly moved the conversation along to the next gift, and I realized that even my grandson's authentic joy in my present was being viewed as something to be managed rather than celebrated. The party continued for another hour, but I felt increasingly like a ghost haunting the edges of my own family's life. I helped clean up afterward, but even my attempts to be useful were met with polite deflection. Sophia had hired people to handle the cleanup, and my offers to help were clearly seen as more evidence that I didn't understand how their world operated. As I prepared to leave, Timothy ran up to me with the compass still in his hand. "Grandma, when can we use this? Can you come over tomorrow and show me how it works?" His excitement was pure and genuine, untainted by the social calculations that seemed to govern every other interaction at the party. Before I could answer, Sophia appeared and gently but firmly redirected the conversation. "Timothy, Grandma Vivian has her own busy schedule. We'll have to see when she's available." The dismissal was polite but unmistakable. I drove home in silence, my mind churning with emotions I couldn't quite name. Hurt, certainly. Anger, absolutely. But underneath those immediate reactions was something deeper and more dangerous. Disappointment so profound it felt like grief. The daughter I had raised, the little girl I had loved unconditionally, had grown into someone who was ashamed of me. When I reached my house, I sat in my car for several minutes before going inside. The colonial that Charles and I had filled with love and laughter suddenly felt enormous and empty. I walked through rooms filled with memories, each one now tainted by the knowledge that the family we'd built was fracturing in ways I'd never imagined. That night, I called my attorney, James Morrison, who had handled my affairs since Charles's death. James had been a friend of the family for decades, and he was one of the few people who truly understood the extent of my financial situation. "James," I said without preamble when he answered his phone, "I need to discuss Timothy's trust fund." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "Of course, Vivian. Is everything all right?" "No," I replied, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "Everything is not all right, and I think it's time to make some changes." What Sophia didn't know, what she had never bothered to learn, was that I wasn't just a lonely widow living off her late husband's pension. Charles's pharmaceutical company had been sold for a staggering amount of money 2 years after his death, and I had quietly invested those proceeds with a financial advisor who had turned my inheritance into something approaching a small fortune. More importantly, the trust fund that Sophia was counting on for Timothy's education and future, the trust fund she had mentioned casually in conversations about private schools and college plans, was entirely under my control. She assumed it was a standard inheritance from Charles, something automatic and unchangeable. She had no idea that I had the power to modify or cancel it at will. That trust fund represented more than just money. It was my way of ensuring that Timothy would have opportunities and advantages that would set him up for success in life. It was currently worth nearly $2 million, carefully invested and growing steadily. By the time Timothy turned 18, it would likely be worth considerably more. Sophia had never asked me about the details of the trust fund, never shown any curiosity about how it was structured or what conditions might be attached to it. She had simply accepted it as part of their family's financial landscape, another element of the privileged life she had built for herself and her son. But after what I had witnessed at the birthday party, after hearing my own daughter describe me as an embarrassment, I began to question whether that trust fund was serving its intended purpose.
Was I really helping Timothy by ensuring he would grow up with every material advantage? Or was I contributing to the same superficial value system that had turned my daughter into someone I barely recognized? The next morning, I woke up with a clarity of purpose that surprised me. I spent the day thinking about the party, replaying every conversation and interaction, analyzing them with the dispassionate perspective that comes only with emotional distance. What I saw was a family that had lost its way, seduced by status and appearances at the expense of genuine connection and authentic relationships. I thought about Charles and how he would have reacted to what I'd experienced. He had been a successful businessman, but he had never lost sight of what truly mattered. He would have been appalled to see his daughter treating her own mother with such casual disrespect, and he would have been devastated to realize that his grandson was being raised in an environment where image mattered more than substance. That afternoon, I called James again and asked him to prepare papers that would give me complete control over Timothy's trust fund, including the ability to set new conditions for its distribution. I wanted to explore options that would ensure the money would be used to benefit Timothy without continuing to enable the toxic family dynamics I'd witnessed. "Are you sure about this, Vivian?" James asked carefully. "These kinds of changes can have significant consequences for family relationships." "I'm very sure," I replied. "In fact, that's exactly the point." Over the next few days, I found myself observing my family with new eyes. I paid attention to the subtle ways Sophia managed our interactions, always positioning herself as the responsible adult managing an increasingly problematic elderly parent. I noticed how she spoke about me to Timothy, with a tone that was loving but condescending, as if I were a beloved pet who occasionally misbehaved. Most painfully, I began to see how Timothy was absorbing these attitudes. Despite his genuine affection for me, he was learning to view me as someone who needed to be managed and controlled rather than respected and valued. He would gently correct my behavior when I didn't conform to his parents' expectations, not out of malice, but out of the innocent desire to help everyone get along. A week after the birthday party, Sophia called to invite me to dinner. The invitation came with specific instructions about appropriate attire and behavior, delivered with the kind of cheerful authority that made them sound like helpful suggestions rather than demands. She was planning to introduce me to some important new neighbors, and she wanted to make sure I understood how to make a good impression. As I listened to her carefully worded guidance about topics of conversation to avoid and social cues to watch for, I realized that she genuinely believed she was helping me. In her mind, I was a well-meaning but socially incompetent elderly woman who needed coaching to navigate the complex world she inhabited. The thought that I might be capable of making my own decisions about how to behave was apparently inconceivable to her. That dinner was a masterclass in subtle manipulation. Sophia skillfully steered every conversation away from topics where I might express opinions that differed from her own. When I tried to share stories about my own life experiences, she would politely interrupt with transitions that shifted the focus back to safer ground. I was presented not as an individual with my own thoughts and perspectives, but as a charming family artifact to be displayed and then carefully managed. The other guests were kind enough, but I could see them processing me through the lens of Sophia's presentation. I was Timothy's grandmother, an elderly woman who was lucky to have such a devoted daughter looking out for her interests. My own accomplishments and experiences were irrelevant, except as they related to my role within Sophia's carefully constructed narrative. After dinner, as I was preparing to leave, Timothy asked if I could come to his school's Grandparents' Day the following week. It was a simple request, filled with the kind of innocent enthusiasm that made it impossible to refuse. But before I could respond, Sophia intervened, with a series of concerns about my schedule and the demands of the event. "Grandparents' Day can be overwhelming," she explained to Timothy with patient kindness. "There are a lot of people and activities, and Grandma Vivian might find it stressful. Maybe we should wait until next year when you're a little older and can help take care of her." I watched my grandson's face fall as he processed this rejection, and something inside me snapped. The patient acceptance that had allowed me to endure weeks of condescending treatment suddenly evaporated, replaced by a cold determination that scared me with its intensity. "Actually," I said, my voice cutting through Sophia's explanation with unexpected authority, "I would love to come to Grandparents' Day. Timothy, you can count on me being there." Sophia's smile faltered for just a moment before she recovered her composure. "Of course, Mom. I just want to make sure you're comfortable with everything." "I'm perfectly comfortable," I replied, meeting her gaze directly. "In fact, I'm more comfortable than I've been in a long time." That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I called James and asked him to draft a letter that would be delivered to Sophia and Richard, informing them that Timothy's trust fund had been placed under new conditions. The money would still be available for Timothy's benefit, but its use would now require my explicit approval for every expenditure.
More importantly, I instructed James to include language that would allow me to redirect the trust fund entirely if I determined that it was not serving Timothy's best interests. I wanted Sophia to understand that the financial security she had taken for granted was not a right but a privilege that could be revoked. "This is a dramatic step, Vivian," James warned me during our meeting. "Are you prepared for the consequences?" "I'm prepared for whatever happens," I replied. "What I'm not prepared for is continuing to enable a situation that's damaging my relationship with my family and potentially harmful to my grandson's development." The letter was delivered on a Thursday morning, and my phone started ringing within hours. Sophia's initial call was carefully controlled, her voice carrying just a hint of the panic I knew she must be feeling. "Mom, I think there might be some kind of mistake with the trust fund paperwork. Could you call James and ask him to clarify the new terms?" "There's no mistake, Sophia," I replied calmly. "I've decided that the trust fund needs more oversight to ensure it's being used appropriately." There was a long pause before Sophia responded, and when she did, her voice carried a note of disbelief that bordered on outrage. "Mom, you can't just change the terms of Timothy's inheritance."
That money is for his education and his future. Yes, I agreed, it is for Timothy's future, and I intend to make sure it's used in ways that will actually benefit him rather than just maintaining the lifestyle you've become accustomed to. The conversation that followed was the first honest discussion Sophia and I had had in years. Stripped of her usual diplomatic language and social pleasantries, she revealed the extent of her financial dependence on Timothy's trust fund. The private school tuition, the expensive summer camps, the designer clothes and luxury vacations, all of it had been budgeted with the assumption that the trust fund would cover the costs. More than that, Sophia and Richard had been using the existence of the trust fund as collateral for their own financial decisions. They had taken out loans and made investments based on the assumption that Timothy's financial future was secure, allowing them to take risks with their own money that they might not have otherwise considered. "You're being completely unreasonable," Sophia said, her composure finally cracking. "This isn't just about Timothy. Our whole family's financial stability depends on that trust fund." "No," I corrected her, "your family's financial stability depends on your own ability to manage your resources responsibly. Timothy's trust fund was never intended to subsidize your lifestyle choices." The call ended with Sophia promising to come over the next day to discuss the situation face-to-face. I spent the evening preparing for what I knew would be the most difficult conversation of our relationship, but I felt more centered and purposeful than I had in months. When Sophia arrived the next afternoon, she brought Richard with her, clearly hoping that his legal expertise would help them find a way to reverse my decision. They sat in my living room, the same room where Sophia had played as a child, and attempted to negotiate with me as if I were a business adversary rather than a family member. Richard began by explaining the legal complexities of trust fund management, apparently assuming that I didn't understand the implications of my own decisions. He outlined the potential tax consequences and administrative challenges of the new structure, speaking to me with the patient condescension of a lawyer explaining complicated concepts to a confused client. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, leaning forward with practiced sincerity, "I understand that you want to ensure Timothy's trust fund is managed properly. But these new restrictions you've put in place could actually end up costing him money in the long run. Wouldn't it be better to return to the original structure and perhaps add some advisory oversight instead?" I listened to his presentation with the kind of polite attention I might give to a door-to-door salesman, then responded with a question that clearly caught him off guard. "Richard, do you remember what you said at Timothy's birthday party about assisted living facilities?" He blinked in surprise, clearly not expecting the conversation to take that direction. "I'm sorry, I don't follow." "You suggested that it might be time to consider placing me in assisted living because I was clearly not adapting well to social situations. Do you remember that conversation?" Sophia's face went pale as she realized where this was heading. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair, apparently searching for a diplomatic response.
"I think there might have been some kind of misunderstanding," he said carefully. "We would never want you to think that we don't value your independence." "No misunderstanding," I replied evenly. "I heard the conversation quite clearly. Sophia described me as an embarrassment, and you both agreed that I needed to be managed more carefully to avoid ruining future social events." The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. Sophia and Richard exchanged glances that confirmed everything I had suspected about their private conversations regarding my place in their lives. "Mom," Sophia finally said, her voice small and strained, "we never meant for you to overhear that. We were just frustrated and stressed, and we said things we didn't mean." "No," I said, standing up to signal that the meeting was over. "You said exactly what you meant. And now I am responding in kind. Timothy's trust fund will remain under the new conditions until further notice. If you want to discuss specific expenditures that would benefit his education or development, you can submit proposals through James, and I'll consider them on a case-by-case basis." They left without another word, and I spent the rest of the evening sitting in Charles's old chair, thinking about the path that had led us to this moment. I felt no satisfaction in what I had done, but I also felt no regret. Sometimes the most loving thing a parent can do is refuse to enable behavior that is ultimately destructive. The real test would come in the days and weeks that followed, as Sophia and Richard were forced to confront the reality of their changed circumstances and decide how they wanted to move forward. I had given them a choice, just as they had given me one at Timothy's birthday party. Now we would all have to live with the consequences of our decisions. The consequences of my decision began manifesting within 48 hours. Timothy's private school, Westfield Academy, called on Saturday morning to inquire about the delayed tuition payment for the upcoming semester. The business manager, Mrs. Chen, was diplomatic but firm in her concern about the outstanding balance. "Mrs. Blackwood, we've been trying to reach your daughter about Timothy's account, but we haven't received a response. The autumn semester begins in 2 weeks, and we need to ensure all financial obligations are current." I found myself in the peculiar position of knowing more about my family's financial crisis than the institutions that depended on their payments. "I'll make sure Timothy's education continues uninterrupted. However, there may be some changes in how the payments are processed going forward." After ending that call, I immediately contacted James to arrange for Timothy's tuition to be paid directly from my personal account rather than the trust fund. The boy's education would not suffer because of the conflict between his parents and me, but I wanted Sophia and Richard to understand that their assumptions about automatic financial support were no longer valid. The second call came from Camp Wildwood, where Timothy had spent the previous 3 summers learning sailing and horseback riding among the children of Maplewood Heights elite families. The camp director wanted to confirm Timothy's enrollment for the following summer and discuss the deposit that was apparently overdue. Each conversation revealed another layer of my family's financial dependence on resources they had never truly controlled. Sophia and Richard had built their lifestyle on the foundation of Timothy's trust fund, making commitments and assumptions that extended years into the future. Now they were discovering that foundation had always been more fragile than they realized. On Sunday afternoon, I received an unexpected visitor. Timothy arrived at my door alone, having apparently ridden his bicycle the 3 miles from his house to mine. His face was flushed from the ride and etched with confusion that broke my heart. "Grandma Vivian, can I talk to you?" he asked, his 8-year-old voice carrying a weight of worry that no child should have to bear. I welcomed him inside and prepared his favorite snack, apple slices with peanut butter and honey, the same combination I'd made for his mother when she was his age. We sat at my kitchen table, the compass he'd received at his birthday party positioned carefully between us. "Mom and Dad have been having a lot of serious conversations," Timothy began, his words measured in the way children speak when they're trying to process adult problems. "They keep mentioning your name and something about money and school. Are you mad at us?" The directness of his question caught me off guard. Children have a way of cutting through complexity to reach the emotional core of any situation, and Timothy had identified the central issue with startling clarity. "I'm not mad at you, sweetheart," I said, reaching across to squeeze his small hand. "You haven't done anything wrong. Sometimes adults have disagreements about important things, and those disagreements can create stress for everyone in the family." Timothy nodded solemnly, as if this explanation confirmed suspicions he'd already formed. "Is it about money? Because Mom keeps saying we might have to make changes, and she sounds scared when she talks about it." I had to choose my words carefully. Timothy was old enough to sense that something significant was happening, but he was too young to understand the complex dynamics that had created this situation. More importantly, I didn't want to poison his relationship with his parents, regardless of my own feelings about their behavior. "Sometimes families have to make adjustments when circumstances change," I said. "The important thing to remember is that you are loved by everyone, and nothing that's happening is your fault or your responsibility." We spent the next hour working with the compass, and I taught him how to use it to navigate around my backyard. Timothy was a quick learner, and his genuine fascination with the instrument provided a welcome distraction from the heavier topics that had brought him to my house. As we explored the garden together, I was reminded of similar adventures I'd shared with Sophia when she was young, before life became complicated by social expectations and financial pressures. When Sophia arrived to collect Timothy, her expression was a careful mask that couldn't quite hide her underlying anxiety. She was polite but distant, thanking me for watching him while maintaining the kind of professional courtesy typically reserved for service providers. "Timothy, you can't just disappear like that," she said, her voice carrying an edge of panic that suggested his unsupervised visit to my house represented more than just a breach of family protocol. "We were worried sick when we couldn't find you." Timothy looked confused by the intensity of her reaction. "I told Dad I was going to see Grandma. He was on the phone and just waved at me." Sophia's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and I realized that Richard's distraction during Timothy's announcement had created an unintended opportunity for unsupervised contact between my grandson and me. In their current state of crisis, even innocent family interactions were being viewed through the lens of strategic advantage and potential risk. That evening, Sophia called with what she presented as a reasonable compromise. Her voice carried the kind of forced cheerfulness that people use when they're trying to negotiate from a position of weakness while maintaining their dignity. "Mom, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I want you to know that I understand your concerns about the trust fund. Maybe we can work together to create a structure that gives you more oversight while still ensuring Timothy's needs are met." I recognized the language of strategic retreat, the kind of diplomatic phrasing that acknowledged a shift in power without explicitly admitting defeat. Sophia was offering me exactly what Richard had suggested during their visit, advisory oversight that would allow them to maintain control while giving me the illusion of influence. "I'm listening," I said, genuinely curious about how she would frame this proposal. "Well, what if we set up regular meetings to discuss Timothy's expenses? You could review our plans for his education and activities, and we could get your approval before making any major expenditures. That way, you'd have input into how the money is used, but Timothy wouldn't have to worry about delays or complications with things like school tuition." It was a skillful proposal, designed to address my stated concerns about oversight while minimizing the practical impact on their financial planning. Sophia was offering me a seat at the table, but she was clearly hoping to maintain ultimate control over the agenda and outcomes of those discussions. "That's an interesting suggestion," I replied, "but I think you're misunderstanding the nature of the changes I've made. This isn't about giving me input into your decisions. The trust fund now requires my explicit approval for all expenditures, and that approval will be based on my assessment of what truly serves Timothy's best interests." The silence that followed was profound. I could practically hear Sophia recalculating her approach as she absorbed the reality that her carefully crafted compromise had been rejected. "Mom, that's completely unreasonable," she said, her diplomatic facade finally beginning to crack. "You're essentially holding Timothy's future hostage because you're upset about something that happened at a birthday party. No, I corrected her. I'm taking responsibility for ensuring that Timothy's inheritance is used to benefit him rather than to subsidize a lifestyle that teaches him to value appearances over authentic relationships. The conversation deteriorated quickly from there. Sophia accused me of being vindictive and manipulative. She suggested that my decision was evidence of age-related cognitive decline that should be addressed by medical professionals. She threatened to consult with other attorneys about challenging my authority over the trust fund. I listened to these accusations with surprising calm, recognizing them as the predictable responses of someone whose sense of security had been fundamentally threatened. Sophia was lashing out not because she was evil or malicious, but because she was scared and desperate. "Sophia," I said, when she finally paused in her litany of grievances, "everything you're saying to me right now is being said in anger and panic. I suggest you take some time to think about what you really want to accomplish with this conversation." "What I want to accomplish," she replied, her voice tight with controlled fury, "is to protect my son from the consequences of your petty revenge." "And what I want to accomplish," I responded, "is to protect my grandson from the consequences of being raised to believe that his worth is measured by his family's social status and material possessions." The call ended with both of us recognizing that we had reached an impasse that couldn't be resolved through rational discussion. We were operating from fundamentally different value systems, and neither of us was willing to compromise our core beliefs about what was best for Timothy. Over the next few days, I began to observe my family's crisis from a distance, gathering information through a network of sources that Sophia and Richard had apparently never considered. Maplewood Heights was a small community despite its affluent facade, and news of financial difficulties traveled quickly through social circles where everyone knew everyone else's business. My hairdresser, Elena, had been styling hair for the wealthy women of Maplewood for over 20 years, and she possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of local family dynamics. During my regular appointment on Tuesday morning, she mentioned almost casually that several of her clients had been discussing the Pemberton family's sudden financial constraints. "It's such a shame," Elena said while working on my highlights. "Sophia was telling everyone at the country club that they're having to make some temporary adjustments because of market volatility affecting Richard's investments. But Martha Henley heard from her husband that Richard's been calling around asking about extending credit lines and postponing some major payments." I had to admire Sophia's ability to manage public perception even during a personal crisis. Rather than admitting that my control over Timothy's trust fund had created their financial difficulties, she was maintaining the fiction that their problems were related to normal market fluctuations affecting successful people. It was a face-saving strategy that preserved their social standing while they figured out how to address the underlying issues. Elena continued her commentary while applying toner to my hair. Martha also mentioned that Timothy might not be returning to Westfield Academy this fall. Apparently, they're considering public school options, which is such a big change for families like theirs. This information caught my attention because it suggested that Sophia and Richard were preparing to make significant lifestyle adjustments rather than continuing to fight for control of the trust fund. Public school in Maplewood Heights was actually quite good, but it represented a dramatic shift in social positioning for families who defined themselves by their children's exclusive educational opportunities. My next source of intelligence was Mrs. Patterson, my elderly neighbor who had lived across the street for 30 years and maintained detailed knowledge of every household's comings and goings. She stopped by on Wednesday afternoon with a plate of homemade cookies and a head full of observations about recent activities at Sophia's house. "There's been quite a bit of unusual traffic over at the Pemberton place," she reported while we sat on my front porch enjoying the cookies and afternoon sunshine. "Moving trucks, real estate appraisers, and yesterday there was a luxury car dealership representative there for almost 2 hours." The picture that emerged from Mrs. Patterson's observations was of a family rapidly liquidating assets and downsizing their lifestyle. The moving trucks suggested they were selling furniture or other valuable items. The real estate appraisers indicated they might be considering selling their house. The dealership visit probably meant they were trading down from their expensive luxury vehicles to more affordable options. I found myself feeling a complex mixture of emotions as I processed this information. Part of me was satisfied that Sophia and Richard were finally confronting the reality of their financial situation without the safety net they had taken for granted. But another part of me was genuinely concerned about the impact these changes would have on Timothy, who had done nothing to deserve the disruption of his familiar world. That concern prompted me to make a decision that surprised even me. I called James and asked him to draft a letter to Sophia and Richard outlining specific conditions under which I would be willing to resume partial funding for Timothy's education and essential needs. "Are you sure about this, Vivian?" James asked during our phone conversation. "Yesterday, you were talking about maintaining complete control over all expenditures. Now you're offering to restore some of their financial support. What's changed?" "What's changed," I replied, "is that I'm seeing the human cost of this conflict, and I need to find a way to protect Timothy while still addressing the underlying issues that created this situation." The letter I asked James to draft was carefully structured to offer Sophia and Richard a path back to financial stability, while establishing new boundaries for our family relationships. I was willing to resume paying Timothy's school tuition and covering reasonable expenses related to his education and development. However, this support would come with explicit conditions. First, Sophia and Richard would need to acknowledge that their treatment of me at Timothy's birthday party was inappropriate and hurtful. This wasn't about extracting a public apology, but rather about ensuring they understood that their behavior had real consequences and that they couldn't continue treating me with casual disrespect. Second, they would need to agree to family counseling sessions designed to improve our communication and establish healthier relationship patterns. I wasn't interested in rehashing old grievances, but I wanted professional guidance in creating a family dynamic that worked for everyone involved. Third, major decisions about Timothy's upbringing would need to include my input as his grandmother and the person providing financial support for his future. This didn't mean I wanted to micromanage their parenting, but I did want assurance that Timothy would be raised with values that emphasized character and authentic relationships over superficial social positioning. Finally, the terms of Timothy's trust fund would remain subject to my oversight and approval. I was willing to be reasonable and supportive, but I wanted it understood that this financial support was a privilege that could be revoked if family relationships deteriorated again. The letter was delivered on Thursday morning, and I spent the rest of the day wondering how Sophia and Richard would respond. I had essentially offered them a way to resolve their immediate financial crisis, but only if they were willing to acknowledge that changes needed to be made in how our family functioned. The response came sooner than I expected. Sophia called that evening, and her voice carried a humility that I hadn't heard from her in years. "Mom, we received your letter, and Richard and I have been discussing it all day. We want you to know that we're grateful for your willingness to consider resuming support for Timothy's expenses." I waited for her to continue, sensing that she was choosing her words very carefully. "We also want you to know that we've both been doing a lot of thinking about what happened at Timothy's birthday party and the things we said. We realize that our words were hurtful, and we understand why you reacted the way you did. It wasn't exactly an apology, but it represented more progress than I had expected." Sophia was clearly struggling to balance her pride with the practical necessity of repairing our relationship. "We're willing to consider family counseling if you think it would be helpful," she continued, "and we want to find a way to include you more meaningfully in Timothy's life. We know we haven't been doing a good job of that, and we want to do better." The conversation that followed was the most honest discussion Sophia and I had shared in years. She admitted that the financial crisis had forced her and Richard to confront how dependent they had become on resources they didn't actually control. More importantly, she acknowledged that their treatment of me had been influenced by their own insecurities about social status and their fear of being judged by other parents. "I think we got so caught up in trying to create the perfect life for Timothy that we lost sight of what actually makes life meaningful," she said. "And we started treating you like you were an obstacle to that perfection instead of recognizing that you're one of the most important people in Timothy's world." Richard joined the conversation at that point, and his tone was markedly different from the condescending legal speak he had used during our previous interactions. "Mrs. Blackwood, I owe you an apology for the things I said at the birthday party. I was speaking out of frustration and stress, but that doesn't excuse the disrespect. I also realized that I've been thinking about you as a problem to be managed rather than as Timothy's grandmother who deserves to be valued and included. We talked for almost 2 hours, covering topics that had been avoided or glossed over for years. Sophia explained the financial pressures that had influenced their decision-making, from the social expectations of their peer group to the genuine desire to provide Timothy with every possible advantage. Richard discussed his own family background and how his parents' emphasis on appearances had shaped his approach to success and status. Most importantly, we talked about Timothy and what kind of upbringing would truly serve his best interests. Sophia admitted that she had been so focused on ensuring he fit into their social circle that she had lost sight of helping him develop his own character and values. "I see how happy he is when he spends time with you," she said. "He comes home from your house talking about adventures and stories and all these things that have nothing to do with the stuff that usually occupies his time. I think I've been depriving him of something important by trying to limit those interactions." By the end of the conversation, we had reached an agreement in principle on most of the conditions I had outlined in my letter. Sophia and Richard would acknowledge their mistakes and commit to changing how they treated me. We would begin family counseling within the next month. I would resume covering Timothy's educational expenses while maintaining oversight of the trust fund. And we would work together to create a family dynamic that prioritized authentic relationships over social positioning. The most significant change, however, was in the emotional tenor of our relationship. For the first time in years, I felt like Sophia was talking to me as her mother rather than as an elderly woman who needed to be managed. The defensive barriers she had erected seemed to be coming down, replaced by a vulnerability that reminded me of the little girl I had raised. The implementation of our agreement began the following week with our first family counseling session. Dr. Rebecca Martinez was a family therapist who specialized in multi-generational conflicts, and she had been recommended by James as someone who understood the complex dynamics that can develop around wealth and inheritance issues. Dr. Martinez's office was designed to feel comfortable and non-threatening, with soft lighting and casual furniture arranged to encourage open conversation. Timothy joined us for this first session, and I was curious to see how he would respond to being included in discussions about family relationships. "I'd like to start by having each of you share your perspective on what brought you here today," Dr. Martinez said, after we had settled into our seats. "Timothy, would you like to go first?" My grandson looked around the room uncertainly before answering. "I think everyone's been worried about money and mad at each other, but I don't really understand why. I just want everyone to be happy and for things to go back to normal." His simple statement cut straight to the heart of our family's crisis. While the adults had been engaging in complex power struggles and financial maneuvering, Timothy had been experiencing the emotional fallout of relationships that had become strained and artificial. Sophia spoke next, and her voice carried the careful honesty that characterized her recent conversations with me. "I think I've been making decisions based on fear. Fear of not being good enough, fear of not providing the right opportunities for Timothy, fear of being judged by other people. And those fears caused me to treat my mother in ways that were unfair and hurtful." Richard acknowledged his role in creating an environment where social status had become more important than family relationships. "I come from a family where success was measured entirely by external achievements, and I think I've been pushing that same pressure onto our family without considering the cost." When it was my turn to speak, I found myself reflecting on how the birthday party incident had crystallized years of accumulated frustration and disappointment. "I think I reached a point where I felt like I was becoming invisible in my own family's life," I said. "My opinions didn't matter, my experiences weren't valued, and my relationship with Timothy was being managed and controlled rather than celebrated. The trust fund situation gave me leverage to address those issues, but I realize now that I could have handled it in a less dramatic way." Dr. Martinez listened to each of our perspectives without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions that helped us articulate feelings we had been struggling to express. By the end of the session, she had identified several key patterns that had contributed to our family's dysfunction. The first was a communication style that prioritized politeness over honesty, creating situations where important issues were never directly addressed. The second was a tendency to make assumptions about each other's motivations and feelings without asking for clarification. The third was a power dynamic where financial resources had become tools for control rather than expressions of love and support. Families often develop these patterns gradually over time, Dr. Martinez explained as our session was concluding. The good news is that you're all here because you want things to improve, and you're all willing to acknowledge that changes need to be made. That gives us a strong foundation to work with. She assigned us homework for the following week, individual exercises designed to help us identify our own contributions to the family's problems and communication practices that would help us express our needs and concerns more directly. Timothy's homework was different from the adults. Dr. Martinez asked him to create a list of his favorite memories with each family member and another list of activities he wished we could do together more often. The goal was to help us understand what aspects of our relationships were working well and what changes would be most meaningful to him. The second counseling session revealed the extent to which our family's problems had been influenced by external social pressures. Sophia spent considerable time discussing her anxiety about fitting into Maplewood Heights' social hierarchy and how that anxiety had affected her parenting decisions. I kept thinking that if Timothy didn't have the right clothes, or go to the right school, or participate in the right activities, he would be excluded from opportunities that could affect his entire future, she explained. I never stopped to consider whether those opportunities were actually important to him, or whether they aligned with our family's values. Richard discussed similar pressures related to his legal career and the expectation that successful attorneys in their community would maintain certain lifestyle standards. I realize now that I was spending money we didn't actually have to maintain an image that was ultimately hollow. We were living someone else's definition of success instead of creating our own. My own contributions to the family's dysfunction became clearer during these sessions. I had been withdrawing from family activities rather than directly addressing my concerns about being marginalized. I had allowed resentment to build up over years instead of having honest conversations about feeling excluded or disrespected. I think I assumed that my role as Timothy's grandmother would naturally be valued and protected, I admitted during our third session. When that didn't happen, I became passive-aggressive instead of advocating for myself clearly. Dr. Martinez helped us develop new communication strategies that emphasized direct expression of needs and feelings rather than indirect manipulation or withdrawal. We practiced having difficult conversations in the safety of her office, learning to listen without becoming defensive and to express disagreement without attacking each other personally. The most significant breakthrough came during our fourth session when Timothy shared the lists he had been working on. His favorite memories with me included our compass adventures, baking projects, and stories about his grandfather Charles. His favorite memories with his parents included family vacations, bedtime stories, and casual moments of affection and playfulness. More importantly, his wish list for future activities revealed a child who craved authentic experiences over material privileges. He wanted to go camping, learn to build things with his hands, have regular family game nights, and spend more time hearing stories about his family's history. "I like my school and my friends," Timothy said when Dr. Martinez asked him about the changes that had been happening in his life, "but I don't really care if we have a big house or fancy cars. I just want everyone to stop being worried all the time and to have more fun together." His innocent clarity about what truly mattered helped the adults in the room recognize how far we had drifted from our core values. Sophia began crying as she listened to Timothy's wishes, and I could see her processing the realization that her son's needs were much simpler and more achievable than she had been assuming. "I've been making everything so complicated," she whispered. "I thought I was protecting him and giving him advantages, but I was actually creating stress and distance in our family." The financial aspect of our reconciliation were resolved more quickly than the emotional ones. I resumed paying Timothy's tuition at Westfield Academy, but Sophia and Richard made the decision to transfer him to the local public school for the following year. They had researched the academic programs and realized that the public school offered opportunities that were actually better aligned with Timothy's interests and learning style. I also agreed to cover reasonable expenses related to Timothy's extracurricular activities, but we established new criteria for evaluating those activities. Instead of choosing programs based on social status or college application value, we would prioritize activities that Timothy genuinely enjoyed and that contributed to his character development. The trust fund remained under my oversight, but I created a more structured and transparent process for approving expenditures. Sophia and Richard would submit quarterly proposals outlining their plans for Timothy's education and development, and I would provide feedback and approval based on clearly defined criteria that emphasized his long-term well-being over short-term social positioning. Perhaps most importantly, we established regular family traditions that were designed to strengthen our relationships and create positive shared experiences. Sunday dinners became a weekly commitment, with rotating responsibility for cooking and conversation topics that encouraged everyone to share their thoughts and experiences. Timothy and I resumed our compass adventures, but now they became family activities that included Sophia and Richard. We explored local hiking trails, visited historical sites, and took weekend camping trips that gave us opportunities to connect with each other away from the social pressures of Maplewood Heights. The changes in our family dynamic became apparent to others in our community, but not in the way I had expected. Instead of being viewed as a family in crisis, we began to be seen as a family that had successfully navigated difficult challenges and emerged stronger. Other grandparents began reaching out to me for advice about their own struggles with adult children and concerns about being marginalized in their grandchildren's lives. Parents in Sophia's social circle expressed admiration for their decision to prioritize family relationships over social status, and several families began questioning their own assumptions about what constituted successful parenting. The most meaningful validation of our progress came from Timothy himself. His anxiety levels decreased significantly as our family relationships became more stable and authentic. His grades improved not because we were pressuring him to achieve, but because he was happier and more confident. Most importantly, he began expressing his own opinions and preferences more clearly, knowing that his thoughts and feelings would be valued and respected. 6 months after the birthday party that had precipitated our family crisis, we found ourselves in a place none of us could have imagined. The trust fund that had once been a source of conflict had become a tool for positive family planning. The social pressures that had once driven our decision-making had been replaced by authentic values and priorities. The relationships that had once been strained and artificial had become sources of genuine joy and support. Sophia and I developed a new appreciation for each other that was based on mutual respect rather than obligatory family loyalty. She began valuing my experience and perspective as resources that could enrich Timothy's upbringing rather than obstacles to be managed. I began recognizing her genuine love for her son and her desire to be a good parent, even when her methods had been misguided. Richard and I also found common ground in our shared commitment to Timothy's well-being and our recognition that true success was measured by the quality of our relationships rather than the accumulation of status symbols. But the greatest transformation was in Timothy himself, who emerged from our family's crisis as a more confident, authentic, and emotionally secure child. He had learned that families could disagree and still love each other, that problems could be solved through honest communication and mutual respect, and that his own worth was not dependent on external validation or material possessions. The compass that had started as a birthday gift became a symbol of our family's journey toward more authentic relationships and values. We used it not just for physical navigation during our outdoor adventures, but as a metaphor for finding our way through the complex challenges of family life with integrity and mutual support. The real test of our family's transformation came during the holiday season. Christmas had always been a production in Sophia's household, with elaborate decorations, expensive gifts, and carefully orchestrated gatherings designed to impress their social circle. This year would be different, and everyone knew it. Sophia called me in mid-November to discuss their plans, and I could hear the uncertainty in her voice as she navigated this new landscape of authentic family relationships versus social expectations. "Mom, Richard and I have been talking about Christmas, and we want to do something more meaningful this year, less focused on expensive gifts and more focused on spending quality time together as a family." I was pleased by this shift in priorities, but I also recognized the challenge it represented for Sophia, who had spent years defining herself through her ability to create picture-perfect holiday experiences. "Mom, Richard and I have been talking about Christmas, and we want to do something more meaningful this year, less focused on expensive gifts and more focused on spending quality time together as a family." I was pleased by this shift in priorities, but I also recognized the challenge it represented for Sophia, who had spent years defining herself through her ability to create picture-perfect holiday experiences. "What did you have in mind?" I asked, genuinely curious about how they plan to balance their new values with Timothy's expectations and their social obligations. "Well, we were hoping you might be willing to host Christmas dinner at your house this year. Timothy has been talking about wanting to see all of Grandpa Charles's old photo albums, and he loves spending time in your kitchen helping with cooking projects." The request surprised me. Sophia's house was perfectly designed for entertaining, with professional-grade appliances and formal dining spaces that could accommodate large gatherings. My house was comfortable but more modest, with a kitchen that had been updated over the years but still retained the warm, lived-in feeling that comes from decades of family meals. "I would love to host Christmas dinner," I replied, already mentally planning a menu that would encourage participation from everyone. "But I want to make sure you're comfortable with a more casual approach. My house isn't set up for the kind of formal entertaining you usually do." Sophia laughed, and for the first time in years, it sounded completely natural and unguarded. "Mom, that's exactly why we want to do it at your house. We want Timothy to experience the kind of Christmas you and Dad used to create for me when I was growing up." The weeks leading up to Christmas became an exercise in rediscovering family traditions that had been forgotten in the pursuit of social perfection. Timothy and I spent Saturday afternoons baking cookies using recipes that had been passed down through 3 generations of our family. Sophia joined us for these sessions, and I watched her reconnect with skills she had learned as a child but abandoned as an adult. "I remember making these cookies with you when I was Timothy's age," she said, while rolling out dough for Gingerbread Man. "I used to love how the whole house would smell like cinnamon and vanilla for days afterward." Timothy absorbed these stories with fascination, learning about his mother's childhood and understanding his family's history in ways that had been obscured by years of focus on present-day social positioning. He asked detailed questions about his grandfather Charles and wanted to know about traditions from even further back in our family tree. Richard proved surprisingly enthusiastic about these more intimate family activities. He had grown up in a household where Christmas was primarily about expensive gifts and formal gatherings, and he seemed genuinely relieved to participate in something that felt more authentic and meaningful. "I never realized how much work went into creating the kind of family traditions I always admired from the outside," he confided to me while we were stringing lights around my Christmas tree. "My parents hired people to handle most of the holiday preparations, so I never learned how to do any of this myself." The gift exchange that Christmas morning reflected our family's new priorities. Instead of expensive electronics and designer clothes, we focused on presents that were thoughtful and personal. Timothy gave me a hand-drawn map of all the places we had explored together using his compass, complete with detailed notes about what we had discovered at each location. Sophia's gift to me was a photo album she had created, filled with pictures of Timothy and me together over the years, along with handwritten notes describing her favorite memories of watching us interact. It was the kind of present that required time and emotional investment rather than financial resources, and it meant more to me than any expensive item could have. My gift to Timothy was a leather-bound journal where he could record his adventures and thoughts, along with a promise that we would take a special trip together to a place he had never been before. For Sophia and Richard, I had prepared envelopes containing documentation of education funds I had established for future grandchildren, and a commitment to match dollar for dollar any contributions they made to charitable causes they cared about. The most significant gift, however, was one I gave to the entire family. I had been working with James to restructure Timothy's trust fund in a way that would provide him with financial security while encouraging him to develop his own values and work ethic. Instead of receiving a lump sum when he turned 18, Timothy would now receive graduated distributions tied to specific milestones that emphasized education, community service, and personal development. The trust would pay for his college education regardless of which school he chose, but additional funds would only be available if he demonstrated genuine commitment to using his advantages for positive purposes. I want Timothy to understand that wealth is a tool for creating meaningful experiences and helping others, I explained as I outlined the new structure during our Christmas dinner. But I also want him to develop his own sense of purpose and accomplishment rather than simply inheriting a lifestyle. Timothy listened to these explanations with the seriousness of a child who was beginning to understand that the adult world involved complex responsibilities and choices. He asked thoughtful questions about how the trust fund worked and what kinds of community service projects might qualify for the additional distributions. "Does this mean I have to be perfect to get the money?" he asked with the direct honesty that children bring to complicated topics. "No, sweetheart," I replied, pulling him onto my lap. "It means you have to be thoughtful about how you use the advantages you've been given. Everyone makes mistakes, but the important thing is learning from them and trying to use your resources to make the world a little bit better." Sophia was openly emotional as she listened to these conversations. I could see her processing the realization that her son was developing a more mature and nuanced understanding of wealth and responsibility than many adults ever achieve. "I'm proud of the young man you're becoming," she told Timothy as we cleaned up after dinner, "and I'm grateful that Grandma is helping you learn these important lessons." The months that followed Christmas brought new challenges and opportunities for our family to practice the communication and relationship skills we had been learning in therapy. Sophia's decision to enroll Timothy in public school for the fall semester required navigating social pressure from other parents in their peer group, some of whom viewed the change as evidence of financial difficulties or declining standards. Instead of being defensive about their choice, Sophia and Richard began talking openly about their decision to prioritize Timothy's individual needs and their family's values over social expectations. Their honesty about the process they had gone through to reassess their priorities resonated with other parents who were struggling with similar issues. "We realized we were making decisions based on what other people might think rather than what was actually best for our son and our family," Sophia explained to a friend who questioned their choice during a chance encounter at the grocery store. "It's been liberating to focus on what really matters to us." This kind of authentic communication became a pattern in Sophia's interactions with their social circle. Instead of maintaining facades and managing impressions, she began sharing genuine thoughts and experiences, which actually strengthened her relationships with people who valued substance over superficiality. The financial restructuring of our family's resources also created opportunities for positive engagement with our community. The charitable matching fund I had established led to family discussions about causes we cared about and ways we could make meaningful contributions to addressing local needs. Timothy became particularly interested in programs that provided educational opportunities for children whose families couldn't afford private schools or extensive extracurricular activities. He had begun to understand his own privileges and wanted to help create similar opportunities for other young people. "I think every kid should have the chance to learn about things they're interested in," he said during one of our family meetings about charitable giving. "Just because their parents don't have a lot of money doesn't mean they shouldn't get to try new things and have adventures." His insight led to our family's involvement with a local nonprofit organization that provided after-school and summer programs for children from lower-income families. Timothy initially worried about Timothy spending time with children from very different socioeconomic backgrounds, but she quickly realized that these interactions were broadening his perspective and developing his empathy in valuable ways. "I remember making these cookies with you when I was Timothy's age," she said while rolling out dough for Gingerbread Man. "I used to love how the whole house would smell like cinnamon and vanilla for days afterward." Timothy absorbed these stories with fascination, learning about his mother's childhood and understanding his family's history in ways that had been obscured by years of focus on present-day social positioning. He asked detailed questions about his grandfather Charles and wanted to know about traditions from even further back in our family tree. Richard proved surprisingly enthusiastic about these more intimate family activities. He had grown up in a household where Christmas was primarily about expensive gifts and formal gatherings, and he seemed genuinely relieved to participate in something that felt more authentic and meaningful. "I never realized how much work went into creating the kind of family traditions I always admired from the outside," he confided to me while we were stringing lights around my Christmas tree. "My parents hired people to handle most of the holiday preparations, so I never learned how to do any of this myself." The gift exchange that Christmas morning reflected our family's new priorities. Instead of expensive electronics and designer clothes, we focused on presents that were thoughtful and personal. Timothy gave me a hand-drawn map of all the places we had explored together using his compass, complete with detailed notes about what we had discovered at each location. Sophia's gift to me was a photo album she had created, filled with pictures of Timothy and me together over the years, along with handwritten notes describing her favorite memories of watching us interact. It was the kind of present that required time and emotional investment rather than financial resources, and it meant more to me than any expensive item could have. My gift to Timothy was a leather-bound journal where he could record his adventures and thoughts, along with a promise that we would take a special trip together to a place he had never been before. For Sophia and Richard, I had prepared envelopes containing documentation of education funds I had established for future grandchildren and a commitment to match dollar for dollar any contributions they made to charitable causes they cared about. The most significant gift, however, was one I gave to the entire family. I had been working with James to restructure Timothy's trust fund in a way that would provide him with financial security while encouraging him to develop his own values and work ethic. Instead of receiving a lump sum when he turned 18, Timothy would now receive graduated distributions tied to specific milestones that emphasized education, community service, and personal development. The trust would pay for his college education regardless of which school he chose, but additional funds would only be available if he demonstrated genuine commitment to using his advantages for positive purposes. I want Timothy to understand that wealth is a tool for creating meaningful experiences and helping others, I explained as I outlined the new structure during our Christmas dinner. But I also want him to develop his own sense of purpose and accomplishment rather than simply inheriting a lifestyle. Timothy listened to these explanations with the seriousness of a child who was beginning to understand that the adult world involved
He's learning that people's worth isn't determined by their family's financial situation, she observed after watching Timothy patiently help a 6-year-old with a challenging craft project. These kids are just as smart and creative as his classmates at Westfield, they just haven't had the same opportunities. Richard also became more involved in community service, using his legal skills to provide pro bono assistance to families navigating complex bureaucratic systems. This work reminded him of why he had originally been drawn to law and gave him a sense of purpose that had been missing from his corporate practice. The most profound change in our family dynamic was the elimination of the performance aspects that had previously characterized our interactions. We no longer felt compelled to present perfect versions of ourselves to each other or to maintain artificial boundaries based on generational expectations. Timothy felt free to express opinions that might contradict his parents' preferences, knowing that disagreement didn't threaten his security or their love for him. Sophia began asking for my advice about parenting challenges, viewing my experience as a resource rather than as outdated interference. Richard started sharing stories about his own childhood and family background, creating opportunities for deeper understanding and connection. Dr. Martinez commented on these changes during one of our final therapy sessions. What I'm seeing is a family that has learned to value authenticity over perfection and connection over control. You've developed the skills to navigate disagreements without damaging your relationships, and you've created space for everyone to be genuine rather than performative. The session that marked our formal conclusion of therapy focused on strategies for maintaining the progress we had made and handling future challenges that might test our new relationship patterns. We discussed specific techniques for managing stress and conflict without reverting to old defensive behaviors. The work you've done here has established a foundation, Dr. Martinez explained, but maintaining healthy family relationships requires ongoing attention and commitment. The skills you've learned need to be practiced regularly, especially during times of stress or significant change. We agreed to schedule periodic check-in sessions, not because we were having problems, but because we wanted to continue strengthening our communication and relationship skills. This proactive approach reflected our commitment to prioritizing family well-being over time. 1 year after the birthday party incident that had precipitated our family crisis, we found ourselves celebrating Timothy's 9th birthday in a completely different way. Instead of an elaborate party designed to impress other parents, we organized a small gathering focused on activities Timothy genuinely enjoyed. The party took place at a local nature center, where Timothy and his friends could participate in educational programs about wildlife and environmental conservation. The activities were engaging and meaningful, and the children were genuinely excited about learning new things and exploring the natural world. I watched Sophia interacting with the other parents, no longer anxious about managing impressions or maintaining social status. She was relaxed and genuine, engaging in conversations about their children's interests and development rather than comparing achievements or possessions. When Timothy opened his gifts, the focus was on thoughtfulness rather than expense. He received books about exploration and adventure, art supplies for creative projects, and equipment for outdoor activities.
Each present reflected genuine consideration of his personality and interests rather than adherence to social expectations about appropriate gifts. The most meaningful moment came when Timothy asked me to help him use his compass to lead the other children on a nature walk around the center's trails. As I watched him confidently explaining how navigation worked and pointing out interesting features of the landscape, I realized that our family's journey through conflict and reconciliation had given him skills and confidence that would serve him throughout his life. He had learned that family members could disagree and work through their differences with love and respect. He had discovered that his worth was not dependent on external validation or material possessions. Most importantly, he had experienced the satisfaction that comes from using his advantages to help and teach others. The trust fund that had once been a source of family conflict had evolved into a tool for positive development and community engagement. Timothy understood that his financial advantages came with responsibilities, and he was already demonstrating wisdom and maturity in how he thought about using those resources. The public school that Sophia and Richard had initially viewed as a compromise had actually provided Timothy with a more diverse and enriching educational experience than the exclusive private institution where he had previously been enrolled. He was thriving academically while also developing friendships with children from many different backgrounds and family situations. Perhaps most significantly, our family had developed a reputation in Maplewood Heights as people who valued substance over superficiality and who were willing to make choices based on their principles rather than social pressure. This authenticity had actually enhanced rather than diminished their standing in the community as other families began seeking their perspective and friendship. The compass that Timothy had received at his 8th birthday party had become a symbol of our family's navigation through challenging territory toward more authentic relationships and values. We used it regularly during our outdoor adventures, but it also served as a reminder that finding the right direction in life requires both clear tools and the wisdom to use them properly. As I reflected on the transformation our family had undergone, I realized that the crisis precipitated by my decision to restructure Timothy's trust fund had ultimately strengthened rather than damaged our relationships. By refusing to accept treatment that diminished my value and dignity, I had created an opportunity for all of us to examine our priorities and make changes that served everyone's best interests. Sophia had evolved from someone who was driven by social anxiety and external validation into a mother who prioritized her son's character development and her family's authentic happiness. Richard had discovered that true success was measured by the quality of his relationships and contributions to his community rather than by material acquisitions or professional status. Timothy had learned that being loved and valued didn't require perfect behavior or constant achievement, but rather honesty, kindness, and consideration for others. He had developed confidence in his own worth that was independent of his family's wealth or social position. The trust fund that had once represented potential conflict had become a foundation for family collaboration and community engagement. Instead of being a source of entitlement or family tension, it was now a tool for teaching values and creating opportunities for meaningful contribution. Our story had evolved from one of conflict and disappointment into one of growth and reconciliation. The birthday party that had initially seemed like evidence of irreparable family dysfunction had actually been the catalyst for positive change that none of us could have imagined. The lesson I had intended to teach my daughter about respect and dignity had evolved into a broader education for our entire family about what constituted genuine success and meaningful relationships. We had all learned that authentic happiness came not from external validation or material accumulation, but from honest communication, mutual support, and the satisfaction of using our resources to benefit others. As Timothy approached his 10th birthday, I found myself looking forward to celebrating not just his growth and development, but our family's continued journey toward deeper understanding and more authentic relationships. The compass would continue guiding our adventures together, both literal and metaphorical, as we navigated the ongoing challenges and joys of family life. The trust fund that had once been a source of conflict had become a foundation for teaching values and creating opportunities for meaningful contribution. Our story had evolved from one of conflict and disappointment into one of growth and reconciliation. The birthday party that had initially seemed like evidence of irreparable family dysfunction had actually been the catalyst for positive change that none of us could have imagined. The lesson I had intended to teach my daughter about respect and dignity had evolved into a broader education for our entire family about what constituted genuine success and meaningful relationships. We had all learned that authentic happiness came not from external validation or material accumulation, but from honest communication, mutual support, and the satisfaction of using our resources to benefit others. As Timothy approached his 10th birthday, I found myself looking forward to celebrating not just his growth and development, but our family's continued journey toward deeper understanding and more authentic relationships. The compass would continue guiding our adventures together, both literal and metaphorical, as we navigated the ongoing challenges and joys of family life. The trust fund that had once been a source of conflict had become a foundation for teaching Timothy that true wealth lies not in what you possess, but in how you use your advantages to create meaningful experiences and positive impact in the world. Our family had learned to treasure what money couldn't buy: respect, understanding, and the irreplaceable joy of genuine connection across generations. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.